This is Startup Playbook, an All Turtles podcast series about how startup founders and product teams tackle some of entrepreneurship's biggest challenges. I'm your host, Marie McCoy Thompson. As we've said a number of times throughout this series, any good startup or product team will be focused on solving a real problem. So here's one. 68% of people feel overwhelmed by the news. That's according to a Pew study. And it makes sense. With the constant deluge of stories on violence and pollution and corruption and global issues, if you're trying to stay informed, how could you not feel overwhelmed? Especially in today's increasingly divided political climate. That is the problem that Chris Ploeg and Gabe Campodonico wanted to address. So they drew from their experience heading up the design team at Evernote. And with the early support of All Turtles co-founder, Phil Libin, they built a product called Sift. Sift is a news therapy app. So Sift aims to alleviate the anxiety and stress that comes from reading today's headlines while still providing in-depth information on contentious issues. Chris and Gabe are both even-keeled, thoughtful people, and I think their product is a reflection of who they are. I want to get into the interview with them, but let me take a second to describe what the product looks like and how it works. The app is comprised of a series of digital cards that you swipe through. Each card presents information, all of it linked to primary sources in a digestible, straightforward way. Think Wikipedia in terms of its objective tone, but much more visually appealing. It's designed beautifully. Every so often, one of the cards is interactive, and these interactives are like little games to keep you engaged as you work your way through the information. The way this product came to be is a prime example of how to thoughtfully think through product design and how to execute it well. In this episode, you'll hear from Chris and Gabe about their design process, and you'll learn why Sift was an early catalyst for pushing All Turtles into existence. Let's get into it. Thank you both so much for being here. I'm excited to talk to you about product design.
Our pleasure.
Absolutely. Looking forward to it.
So if you could just both introduce yourself to start off.
So I'm Gabe Campodonico. I am one of the co-founders of Sift.
I'm Chris Ploeg, and I'm one of the co-founders of Sift.
Can you give an overview of Sift? What is Sift?
So Sift is a way or a place where you can get away from the headlines and the hyperbole and the contentious arguments and learn more about the background behind some of these issues. So we cover things that are contentious, but we try to talk about them in a way that gets away from the day-to-day news churn and helps you understand the history. We offer quite a bit of data to help unpack, what feels true versus what feels like opinion. The hope being that this can give you kind of a foundation for then going back and reading headlines and dealing with the hyperbole and feeling like you're a lot more grounded when you do that.
We were looking for something to help provide the foundation to better prepare yourself for kind of turning off the news. We feel like consuming or being a part of the news and what's happening right now is like it's a civic duty. And so you have to do what's healthy for you in terms of like if things are triggering and overwhelming you and all those things, you have hard decisions to make. But totally putting your head in the sand is things are still going to happen. Just because you're closing your eyes doesn't mean I can't see you.
So one of the things we do, we are as often as possible trying to pull from primary sources, things that are often not particularly accessible. Everyone is very busy. They don't have the time to dig through academic papers and try to unpack complicated data visualizations and all these sorts of things. So one of the things we're trying to do is kind of elevate pieces of those things in a way that's more accessible, while at the same time we give you access to those sources.
This framing of of news therapy, I think, is something that we can kind of unpack a little bit more in terms of it being a central decision that informed a ton of other decisions that until we started thinking about what maybe that meant to us, we didn't realize how few limitations we actually had, and that by not having enough structure, we were struggling to make some of those decisions. And I'll always be thankful for that as a framing mechanism so that we have a thing to say this is news therapy. And sure, we're defining what that is. So it's not a black and white thing. But we get to ask ourselves with every decision, is this our idea of news therapy? Is this therapeutic? And when you have that framing mechanism, it makes it a lot easier to make a decision because you're not just in your head saying, do I like this? Will other people like this? Can we test this? Or all those other things that are all part of the process, but don't ladder up to any central thing.
So what's the origin story of Sift? How did it come to be? I heard it had something to do with the 2016 election.
That and Denogonizer. Those two things were big players.
What is Denogonizer?
The official beer of the Sift team.
Right, yes.
Yeah. No, I think that Gabe and I had been talking with a friend and another former Evernoter, Andrew Sinkoff, about what we might be able to work on together. It was mostly an excuse to drink beer and eat food, but it was really us trying to get our heads wrapped around. We knew something was going to be next, and we wanted to try to figure out what that was. A conversation at Drake's occurred over in Oakland about kind of, I don't know if we've seen an election quite like the 2016 election before. We're definitely already starting to see some familiar things from that. So like we have not corrected course, just yet. But I think those things led us to talk about what we were doing. How do I make sure I'm being exposed to opinions that I don't just agree with already? Because that's not super helpful. It maybe makes you feel better about yourself, but if your goal is to feel better about yourself, there's all sorts of different things you can do. If your goal is to be informed and to be challenged, then having people tell you look great isn't super helpful.
Well, I don't know. I mean,
you always look great,
right? And I never get tired of hearing that personally. Just to put that out there,
Note to self.
No, so you're sitting there at Drake's, you're discussing the craziness of the news cycle and what you can do about it. What were some of the first ideas that came out of that conversation? Because as far as I know, those initial discussions about an idea for a product were pretty different from what you ended up making.
Right. I mean, I think what we were really thinking about there was a lot about curation. So we were thinking, there's probably like really good journalism being done across every topic, everything that's being debated in the election right now. But again, to go and find those things is this kind of needle in the haystack problem. So initially, that's what we were looking at. Like, can we be the ones that go out and kind of find those needles and surface them for people so they can get directly to them and get that information, which I think is still a piece of what we're doing. It's just kind of grown beyond that, essentially.
And as designers, are you already thinking of the end product and potential results that might come out of this conversation and these kinds of thought experiments? Are you already visualizing the design of what these kinds of things can look like? Or at this point, are you really just spitballing?
I think we were talking pretty high level for a while first because neither of us had the time to put pen to paper or pixel to screen. And so I think we were chomping at the bit to do just that. So when we finally kind of had some more tangible discussions with Phil and we're going to start taking some steps, I think we honed in on some things very quickly about, one of the things that has not changed from the very beginning. And there's probably more things that haven't drastically changed from the beginning that have in some ways if we went back to our very first prototype. But one of them is we use a card-based metaphor. This is not an infinite scroll kind of thing. We're intentionally kind of doling out or telling the story over a series of cards. And that's true of everything. So we took that originally as words on these cards, flashcards or whatever you want to call them, to where we could kind of tell that story in a progressive fashion. And we applied that to our data visuals to where you continue to just swipe card after card and a data visual might build in. So it is something that can tell a story, but using a different medium than words, right? And I think the idea of these interactives or quizzes or games that we came up with that can challenge your assumptions or give you a tactile kind of a pedagogical experience, all those things fit in with this metaphor as we moved along.
Right. I mean, I think it ties into a little bit of our concern about people's time. So we are trying to help people be able to more efficiently kind of get the information that they need. But you may only have 5 minutes here or 10 minutes there. And you can imagine anything that is kind of in the infinite scroll format, you get 3/4 of the way down the page, if you leave, you're not coming back.
Right.
So we were trying to find a way to allow people to kind of read as much as they want and know that they have a place to come back to a little bit more like a book would work. So if you stop on page 72, you know that where you were, and it feels much easier to get back to. But I think it ultimately, as we worked on the project, it became more and more useful in more ways in terms of being able to have these interactive moments that were kind of very contained. I think you see a lot of news organizations trying to create these more immersive interactive experiences in their scrolling UI, and they're kind of tying themselves in knots trying to do that because they have to kind of force you to pause in a place, and that's just not kind of natural to a scrolling UI. That in a card format, it's much more natural.
So that's a really interesting design element, is just ensuring that the product that you're creating is not trapping people in the infinite scroll, which is something that you both detest. And so that's something that you sort of come to start talking about over time. The initial conversation, though, it sounds like you're more really just talking about the problem that you're trying to solve, which I think is a common theme in a lot of All Turtles products. And it's why Phil decides that he wants to work with you and everyone else here, is that the product founders are concerned about a problem, and the actual product is more of a means to the end of solving the problem rather than just putting something out there in the world that you think might be cool.
Yeah, definitely. And I do think that's where we sought Phil out, because we have a good relationship with him and we wanted to get his insights originally. But he was at General Catalyst. We were wanting his feedback on this loose idea. So we just met up and grabbed some food to talk about it a little bit. And it wasn't until the day after the election when a text message popped in saying to both of us, hey, remember that thing we talked about several months ago? We should do that. We should do that right now. And I think it probably just kind of crystallized in Phil's mind at that point that, yeah, all these things that kind of, we're talking about one part of a much bigger problem too. We're not directly addressing fake news. We're not going to solve trolling and all these other things, right? And we intentionally avoided all those things because we're never going to be in a position to do that. And so like Facebook and Google and Apple and all these other companies who are gatekeepers of this information are going to have to kind of it's their responsibility to solve certain problems. And so I think we had to look at what can we make the most impact with, and it just so happened to align with some things that we really cared about,
and that Phil cared about too. And as I understand, Sift was one of the first products that got Phil interested in building what became All Turtles.
Yeah, we started working on Sift kind of at the same time that All Turtles was also being started and built. Which was an interesting experiment for sure. So we have definitely been the product we're both kind of trying to figure out what Sift should be, and we've also been very much a part of how should All Turtles work on products.
So as you're thinking through these different possibilities, how does both of your backgrounds as designers influence how you're thinking about which route that you do want to take? Are you able to be more forward-thinking about what the end product will actually look like because you can sort of visualize different ways that you might actually design it?
I think part of that is just a mindset, and also being, we're definitely both outsiders. Neither of us are journalists, admittedly, which I think has been both good and also a challenge. We certainly now are working with journalists. But early on, I think that it allowed us to just approach this like we would approach any other product without being tied to the assumptions that you would have if you had a media background.
And the focus on what you ultimately created with Sift is on calm and wellness as you're intaking information about the news. Why are those things important for a news app?
I think it kind of goes back to what we were talking about before, where the nature of how news is reported is, it's kind of the daily churn. What's going to get the most people to read this thing right now? And it's because advertising is driving the industry. So it's really about getting away from that and not being driven by that, and being able to present information in a way that doesn't need to kind of raise the adrenaline level to get people interested is essentially the idea. News therapy kind of works in two ways. One of them has to do with the goals, which is to be calmer, to be able to deal with the news better. The other thing that it does is helps us understand what we should be talking about. So you don't need news therapy from things that aren't contentious. Like, travel reporting is not something that we need to worry about. It is going to be those most contentious issues. So it is there is a tension there between the idea of being calmer and the types of topics that we are covering, for sure. So that is one of the challenges that we continue to face.
So you're dealing with these contentious topics, pretty divisive issues. How are you designing the product so that when someone opens it up and starts reading about each topic, that they are able to intake the information in an open-minded and calm way? It sounds like that's part of your philosophy, but how do you actually design something to do that successfully?
A lot of that actually has to do with the writing. The editors working on this are working very hard. We obviously, when you write a thing, you write many drafts, and as they go through each consecutive draft, they are trying to look at the language and look at are we falling into the normal traps of the kind of headline news way of characterizing things, or is there a way that we can say this that's more neutral and less about inflaming emotions and things like that. So that is actually kind of a constant process that we're going through, identifying those things and how we can do those things best. Again,
so words are key.
Words are very important
here. It is
here.
a word product.
It is a word product.
I mean, I'm really proud of what we've made from a user experience standpoint, all these other things, but these interactives were meant to I think Gabe has kind of explained how we want to help people think through things in a different way. And then our design challenge was this pedagogical concept of like interacting with something and having it feel tactile and physical. And so that led us to do things like we probably have really horrible internal names for all these interactives. But like the noodle game is one of the things that we made, which is really just, it's like a connect the dots type of thing where there are things on one side and things on another, and you can kind of drag these little noodles to connect them. And it's kind of fun and people feel it's pretty enjoyable. The tagline that we've kind of crystallized around for series 1 is feel news differently. We want you to be doing a thing while you're thinking about a thing. And as soon as we started working on this stuff, the first 2 books I bought were about like the bias heuristics to make sure we're understanding like our humanness as much as we can. And like, how do we learn and how do we retain information and what leads to a good pedagogical experience. And those 2 things have definitely stuck with us as we've moved along and continue to challenge us to like reach for something that does feel that way or does deliver on this type of thing.
Can you talk a little more about designing these little interactives?
The TLDR is that pop quizzes are not therapeutic. So we don't do those, but we do try to put you in a position where you can interact with something. So the noodle game is there are a series of kind of little bars on the left and little bars on the right. And when you drag from one, you can connect a little, I'm a musician, so I connect cables from one thing to another. And so it was definitely inspired by some cool things like that and some other kind of modular kind of building block type things, but just the idea of you have this little thing and you can drag it wherever you want and you can connect it to one thing and second guess yourself and move it to another thing.
We often use them when there's something that maybe seems a little bit surprising. So this was a list of what countries are getting the most visas, essentially. And India in particular, I'm going to give away the answer here, spoiler alert, gets the vast majority of H-1B visas. And while you might have expected it to be them to get a lot, it's really surprising how many they get relative to other countries. So it's also kind of a place for discovery, right? So rather than just telling you that, we allow you to kind of go through this kind of active exercise to learn it, essentially.
What are some of the other ones too? There's the noodle one.
There's a swiper game, which is somewhat similar, but it's really just like a true false type of thing where you have an answer where you can just swipe it to the left or to the right, and it's not always just true or false. It could be. So I think in the immigration topic, it was something that was looking at historically who, by the census, who was considered to be white by the government and who was not or had never been considered white.
I remember you talked about not wanting to make the whole thing into a game and incorporating some game design elements, but but really keeping the focus on news therapy as the end goal rather than a news game. Can you just talk about that thinking and how as you're designing it, striking that balance?
Taking a more kind of gamified approach was something that we explored. It was almost kind of a due diligence kind of thing. Like if we're going to get people to engage with this and really use it, how do we create those right kind of feedback loops to get people to do that? We kind of quickly went away from that because it just didn't feel like it aligned well with kind of the ethos of what we were doing. It was just a little too lighthearted when we were dealing with such significant subject matter. So that was really where we kind of decided that while the interactivity was really good and useful, we needed to use it in another way.
Yeah, not to collect virtual badges and score points and have a leaderboard. None of those things. I suppose they could be therapeutic for some person in a certain way, but probably not ultimately calming.
What other design choices were you making to ensure that it was both informative and therapeutic? I know color palette was part of it, the blues that are present throughout.
Right, and that's that was very much a part of the initial experiment, and that's obviously going to be something we'll continue to look at is like, how does design language affect this? Making things blue is kind of one simple way to do that, but it's something certainly we'll continue to explore because it also needs to be engaging. If it's that is one juggling act that we are doing, is that if you pull all the life out of a thing, then it's just boring. Then it is. I mean, I think Wikipedia is great, but it's not a place that you go to. You go there for a very pragmatic reason.
Or you're my brother, and you just go and you click around for hours.
Yeah, sure,
days.
Sure.
One smart cookie.
But I think it's something that we always want to keep in mind. Like the previous version was like bright red, which is certainly not calming. Not that means everything needs to be blue, but...
Other things are Micah, one of our outstanding designers here at All Turtles, helped us with the word mark. And the word Sift is 4 letters. There's one that has movement, and there are 3 that, if you are especially in all caps and in a sans serif, they're very geometric. They're very rigid: an I, an F, and a T. And I think we wanted to have a logo mark that had some flow, and that those 3 last letters kind of had some movement that the first letter had. And so he started working on a word mark for us. And there's a part to the I that kind of carries up to kind of get close to connecting with the dot on the lowercase I. And some of the initial concepts, it was very sharp. It was very aggressive looking. It's something that you could have like removed and tattooed on your bicep if you had biceps. I don't, but and it was one of those things where we just looked at it and was like, that could possibly draw blood. We probably shouldn't. That it's too sharp. It's too aggressive. Can we tone that down and have it be part of like a graceful curve, not something you might poke your eye out with? And so those were things that just kind of helped lead us in a direction where if you don't have that framing mechanism, it could matter as much as whether you're in a good mood or not as to what your decision ends up being, or what you saw recently that inspired you, or, those types of things. And so I think those types of things were super helpful.
I mean, now that I'm thinking about the design and the look of it, in terms of not having these sharp edges that look like you could poke your eye out with them or tattoo them on yourself to intimidate people, there's some sort of soft shapes that are present throughout. Was that part of the same sort of line of thinking?
What we were trying to do there is kind of stay away from any kind of representational imagery. We're dealing with these challenging topics. So just doing things that are kind of abstract and pattern-like that would create some visual interest, but wouldn't necessarily wouldn't mean anything really. I think since then, we are kind of embracing more that these are topics that are going to be difficult regardless, and we don't need to completely shy away from those things. So each topic now does get an illustration that kind of illustrates the topic and kind of how we're going to think about it. So that was a really challenging exercise in that, one of the new topics coming out is gun violence. So how do you create an illustration about gun violence that's not overly violent?
As soon as you put a gun in an image, it turns out it's marginally less calming for some portion of the population.
Right. So, we're kind of doing things that suggest a gun, kind of a hand essentially, without actually just illustrating a gun. So it's kind of little things like that as well, I think.
And that choice to move away from these abstract shapes and patterns towards illustration, was that just the thought that you are sort of coming to terms with this is news and you're just being straightforward with people who are using it? Or what is it that's bringing you from one approach to the look and feel to another?
It's probably a couple of things, but one of the things is that the thing that we put out in October was an experiment. It was intentionally very finite, and it was intentionally one topic with two parts. There's a lot of things that a lot of bridges we didn't cross with that because we knew we didn't need to. We don't say that Sift is news. We say that Sift is this supplemental tool that helps you be ready for the news. So we've tried to not, our logo mark is not a traditional, what do they call it? Masthead. It's not a traditional, we're not trying to look like a digital newspaper or a digital magazine. We're trying to be an app that you use, not that you read, not that you just read. So I think we constantly are dealing with a bit of tension around that. But I think I'm super excited about what Gabe and Carlos came up with for these illustrations and how they work together to kind of deliver on this.
How did you build user feedback into the design of the app?
So we went ahead and built a Sift sandwich where we had a pre-survey and a post-survey where we asked people how they felt when they consumed the news generally. And we asked on a couple of different vectors about anxiety, about overwhelm, about whether they felt informed or not, and about whether they felt curious or not. And we asked those same questions when they got done. And none of this is scientific. It's self-reported. It's whatever, but it's an indicator, and it's a strong indicator, especially when you have the number of people that we were fortunate enough to have go through this kind of 2-month experiment.
On top of that, we also allowed people to give us feedback literally on every single card, which, we had no idea, would people actually spend the time, tap on this funny little button and type things in?
But boy, did they.
And they did. And it was great. We really felt like, after the experiment was over, we had a really good impression of what people thought about this, what their experience was, what was working, what wasn't working. The only way we would have gotten it is kind of just putting out in the world, which is something that you kind of have to resist that instinct to not want to put something out in the world until it's perfect. And I think we definitely had that feeling. We were like, oh, we're not ready. It's not going to be ready yet. But it turned out to really be the exact thing that we needed to do. We didn't, you don't put something into the App Store that feels like an alpha. You can't put anything in there that's broken and crashing. So it did require a little more work to make sure this thing was polished enough that it made sense to put it in the App Store. But we definitely did it sooner than you probably normally would have.
Well, I know you'll continue to incorporate user feedback and build out Sift even further. But congratulations on what you've put out so far. I think it's a really amazing product, and I'm excited to share it with more people.
Thank you.
Us too.
We are too, yeah.
This podcast is a production of the All Turtles worldwide media empire. We recorded this episode in Donatello Studios in San Francisco, California. If you have any questions, comments, or suggestions, send us an email at hello@all-turtles.com. I read every message. This episode was produced by me, Marie McCoy-Thompson. Thanks to Jim Metzendorf for editing this episode, Chris Ploeg himself for his audio expertise, Ali Packard for our artwork, and Matt Ammerman for our theme music. On behalf of Chris Ploeg, Gabe Campodonico, and the rest of the Sift and All Turtles teams, thanks for listening.